Hi, Tim.
How are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you?
I'm well.
Today we will be talking about the execution gap at universities. So, what is the execution gap, and how do you recognise it when you see it?
So, the execution gap is something that I talk about to describe, on the one hand, what our clients want by way of their ambition, the strategic goals, where they're trying to get to. And then on the other hand, the reality of what actually gets delivered by way of outcomes and outputs. And between those two things, when we start an engagement, there's usually a gulf. And that's why we're brought in. And that's what I refer to as the execution gap. And I guess the reason I talk about it in terms of execution is because it's that execution infrastructure, which we can unpack a little bit, but it's that execution infrastructure that usually is missing. It's not that there's necessarily a lack of ambition, and it's not necessarily that there's a lack of activity on the ground, but there's a disjointedness between those two things, and that's what I refer to as the execution gap.
So, you've worked with loads of clients, loads of universities over many years now. When you walk into an institution and things aren't working, or when you first notice the execution gap, what does that look like on the ground?
So the telltale signs for me are a multitude of initiatives. There's lots and lots of things happening, all seemingly very important, but not necessarily particularly well coordinated. But there's a lot of activity and everybody's at full stretch. The other thing that I see is that oftentimes these organisations are locked into a cycle of launching these strategic initiatives or these new organisational strategies. Time passes, they realise that they haven't delivered or they haven't achieved what they set out to achieve. They look back and they do some post-mortem work to identify what may have gone wrong. Becomes a series of recommendations, and they launch into a new set of strategic activities. And what fails to happen in that process of launch an initiative, review it, diagnose it, launch a new initiative, is that the benefits fail to accrue. The activity continues, and there's no lack of people working really, really hard and at full capacity, but the benefits of that work fail to accrue and move the organisation in a strategic direction. So every time we come to a client and they're locked in this cycle of push out a strategic initiative, time passes, it doesn't achieve what they set out to achieve, they've reviewed it and they're launching a new strategic initiative, 9 times out of 10, I can say that it's this execution gap that we're looking at and dealing with.
Okay, so oftentimes when strategies don't work, we read that as a financial problem. Would you say that that's a correct diagnosis, or would you say that there's a different diagnosis as to why things don't work?
Look, finances and financial management are invariably always part of what we do, and particularly around where money comes from, how it's generated, and what it's invested in internally. That becomes part of the systems and processes that we invariably re-engineer with our clients. But to say, for example, that the problem is simply we don't have enough money, or that we need somehow more of the same kind of money that we're already generating, always misses the point. And the reason I say this is because I think when I look across the sector, you can see that there are different sized organisations, and there are a few very large universities. There are a big number of mid-sized universities and a group of smaller universities. But in every case, the execution gap to me sits at the core of what's not working. And oftentimes the diagnosis that it's financial is really a bit of a red herring. So when we look at the big universities, I think they're probably insulated in many ways from the most acute most acute impacts of the execution gap, insofar as they've got lots of cash flow and they've generally got some pretty good financial buffers in place. So what they tend to do is launch initiative after initiative after initiative, and their cash flow and their savings are such that they can continue to ride those waves of new investment without ever having to rationalize the portfolio. And that's fine so long as those cash flows continue, and in an environment in which business as usual can continue to unfold. But when that's disrupted, then at that point they'll feel acutely the execution gap. And that might be why we see the G08 lobbying so hard for international students to remain at the current levels, to sustain that business as usual approach. If that were to disappear, they'd feel the execution gap very acutely, very quickly. For mid-tier universities, it's a slightly different picture. They don't necessarily have those cash buffers in place. And so what they tend to do is what seems like a rational decision: cost cut, rationalize, slim down, and really try and target their bottom line through savings initiatives. And that might look rational on face value to some from an accounting perspective, but what it doesn't address is the real structural problems that actually underlie the financial realities. And it might give a short-term boost to the bottom line of the organisation, but it certainly doesn't address the execution gap that, again, in my view, is really driving a lot of the problems inside the sector. And then for a small university that has neither the cash buffers nor does it have the ability to really cut back more operationally than it already has, there are very few levers available for it to address the execution gap. And what you actually see is just staff inside of those organisations stretched to the absolute limit, and resources spread so thinly that things become ineffective. So in the three different sizes of organisations, while on face value it may look like they're strategically, I guess, taking different pathways, the underlying structural issue for me is exactly the same. The operational reality is exactly the same in terms of what's not working. And again, it's that execution gap.
You mentioned a moment ago in particular in relation with medium-sized universities and small universities, how the execution gap affects basically staff and people on the ground, whether that be through restructuring and redundancies or whether that is through a workforce that is already at the limit. And I do want to come back to this in a moment. But before we do, elsewhere you've talked about strategy theatre and how often planning looks rigorous, but it falls down at implementation. Can you talk to us about that and how it's related to the execution gap before we go back to how it affects staff?
Yeah, absolutely. So the term strategy theatre, I actually stole from one of our clients who used it to describe the process by which what passes for strategy inside most universities and medical research institutes and other of our clients actually functions. And that is, there's generally a focus on the output, which is a glossy document on a website. And inside of that, all it really articulates are some pretty common catchphrases around being excellent, being world-class, being impactful, being community-oriented, etc., etc. Now, you could go back 20 years across most universities, cross out the name and the date on their so-called strategies and import them into the current situation. They look more or less the same as they did 20 years ago. They're generic, they're devoid of any real substance, and they're certainly not strategic in the way that we think about them, whereby strategy is something around a differentiated purpose, a differentiated mission, and a particular set of choices that an organisation makes to achieve those. Now, that should look very different for every single university, and yet these strategy documents, again, going back as long as you care to, probably look very, very similar. Now, the other side of that is what happens once those are launched. Well, there's generally a big public launch of these things. Everybody inside the organisation might be forced to come up with a very detailed plan of how they're going to actually achieve that strategy. But on first contact with reality, those plans are redundant. By the time they're formulated, they're probably out of date because things have shifted and there's no process in place to actually continue to evolve the strategy and make those choices over time. And people actually lock into this idea that we can plan long term effectively and stick to it and just follow the letter. Or worse than that, that the document on the website itself was the end goal, and once that's launched, strategy's over. So that's strategy theatre, and I think it's worth putting that against what we would think of as strategy as action or strategy as a process, a living, breathing set of choices that are made in perpetuity towards achieving a particular ambition.
All right, so let's pick it back up in relation to staff and how staff fit into this picture. So you've now got an execution gap, you've got strategy theatre going on at a lot of the universities, and you've got a workforce that, in at least some, if not most of the cases, is under strain. So what does that cost an institution to have a labour force that is under strain?
Everything. I think the way I think about this hierarchically is that a strategy first and foremost constitutes a purpose, as in we're all coming together under the banner of this organisation to collectively achieve some objective. That's a purpose. Next in that hierarchy is the culture, which is effectively the sum total of the actions of the individuals that come together under the banner of that organisation to prosecute that agenda. Now, that culture either is in service of that ambition or it's not in service of that ambition. And when you've got staff that are getting mixed messages because of that strategic cycle I talked about earlier, where you launch initiatives, you review them, and then you launch straight into the next one without having achieved anything. Or when you're in those organisations where rationalisation of costs and courses and other things has really been the driver of decision making as opposed to clear strategic choices. Or when you're in those organisations where there are so many initiatives that the clear line of sight as to what the purpose is completely obscured, or even in those ones where people are so stretched because there's so little slack in the system, then the likelihood that the culture is in support of the purpose is decreased. And if you find yourself in that situation, you have zero tools available to you to drive towards that strategic ambition. So when we come in, back to your original question at the top of this view, but one of the things we see is that where strategy is not working, there's a clear gap between the strategic ambition and the culture that's in place to actually achieve that. And again, I think that's a result of those few mechanisms that I've already identified.
All right, so what are the steps to follow to begin to solve some of these issues?
So obviously, if all of this starts with purpose or ambition or vision, whatever you want to call it, I use these interchangeably, it really doesn't matter what you call them. But if that's the driver, then there needs to be a clear shared understanding amongst all the people inside of the organisation why collectively they've come together under the banner of that organisation to prosecute a shared agenda. If that's not clear to everyone, then there's absolutely no chance that it can be achieved. So locking in that shared ambition, or that ambition, vision, whatever you want to call it, is the first key thing. The next thing to do is to redesign the systems and processes that are in place in such a way that they're enabling people to act on their desire to contribute to that ambition. And that could be all sorts of different things. So, for example, that could be the reward and incentive mechanisms that you've got in place inside of the organisation. Do they reinforce the mission of the organisation, or are they at odds with the mission of the organisation? So, for example, if you had an organisation, let's say, that really wanted to deliver on community benefit to the local community, you would hope that the reward and incentive mechanisms within that organisation were geared towards rewarding people for creating value for said community. You wouldn't expect to walk into that organisation and see things like ARC and HMRC grants as the key drivers of individuals' behaviours, because that would likely be at odds with the community benefit that you're trying to create. So all these processes and systems have to be re-engineered in the same direction as the organisational ambition. And that goes for things like reward and incentive mechanisms, but it also goes for bureaucratic processes, like what's an approval process look like, who approves what, who has delegated authority and decision-making authority to do various things, or core things such as how money is distributed and how money is made inside of those organisations. Again, you would hope that in that hypothetical organisation, the money was very closely aligned with some community benefit in one way or another, and not at odds with it completely, because otherwise you'll be getting fracturing of the strategic agendas. Now, and this is the really important bit, the way that you redesign those systems and processes has to be done so as to bring the people along for the journey. And what that means is simply that a strategy is worth nothing if it's not implemented. It's only going to be implemented if people want to implement it. And in my experience, the only reason people will want to implement it is if they feel some sense of ownership or can see themselves reflected in the strategy in the first place. So you have to operate a strategy in such a way and design these processes and systems in such a way that people feel a sense of ownership, and that people will actually, on the other side of the strategy, exercise that ownership by undertaking the work to implement that strategy. So you've got to do that in a deeply consultative and co-design way, but not, and this is a really important caveat, not in a way which is common, which is completely bottom up and just describing the sum of the parts, and every child kind of wins a prize. That's not strategy. That's dispersing your finite efforts and spreading yourself too thin. There still have to be choices made at the top, but you've got to do it in such a way that you bring people along.
That seems to be a really nuanced position.
It is.
A really nuanced point to get to in the development and implementation of a strategy. Before we finish, Tim, can you give me some examples of when this has worked before?
Yeah, absolutely. So, look, where this has worked before, we've seen the leadership really up for the challenge of redesigning those systems and processes in pursuit of an ambition. So, for example, we've worked with a research institute inside of a university, and they really were driving a strategy around equity, social license, and access to a particular type of medical and health devices, therapeutics, and treatments. What they did was embed those values around community co-design, community input and participation into their research agendas in every element of what they do. Everything they do is informed by that. Their decision making is informed through the equity lens that they've put over what they're trying to do. And they're very comfortable to say, even though this might be commercially a very good opportunity for us, it doesn't meet our criteria around reducing the barriers to accessing these kinds of therapies and treatments. And therefore, that's not something that we're going to pursue as an organisation. So they've really embedded that ambition across all their systems and processes, and they've really stuck to it in terms of the decision making. Similarly, a medical research institute that we've worked with is probably spending the next 3 to 4 years redesigning a lot of their capabilities and systems and processes internally to shift themselves away from being an organisation that's very good at winning and administering NHMRC grants to one that's set up to be very good at partnering with philanthropic organisations to co-design large long-term programs that will have real clinical benefits for particular patient sets in their constituency. And again, they're shifting capabilities from grant admin, grant getting to philanthropic fundraising, partnering, and that's a whole different discipline that they need to get good at as an organisation. They're investing in that, they're building out a team, and so on and so forth. But they're genuinely all in on redesigning the organisation to deliver on their ambition.